Hello, guys. Welcome to another amazing episode of the Power Podcast series brought to you by Next Year Power. I'm your host, IC Attitude. Carbon credits are vastly becoming the solution to the increase in emissions rates globally, and Nigeria is not excluded from this growing market. However, existing policies should be in place to guide businesses and industries on this path to environmental sustainability, and an enabling framework would guarantee a healthy and vibrant carbon credit marketplace to position the country toward monitoring the effects of anthropogenic activities on its environment. Today, my guest is Oluwatomi Elizabeth Omogbai, who is the Carbon Sourcing Coordinator, Africa for ALLCOT Trading. Welcome, Oluwatomi. It's nice to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, IC. Thank you for inviting me onto the podcast.
It's a pleasure. So, what are carbon credits and how are they traded?
I'd like to start from the basics, and it's important that I state here that sometimes carbon credits, offset credit, they are used interchangeably, but they mean the same thing. A carbon credit is a tradable unit that represents 1 metric ton of CO2 emissions that was either avoided or sequestered through a project. Now, there are different types of offset projects, such as forestry and conservation, renewable energy, waste to energy. So when a company buys a carbon credit, the company can retire it and claim for a reduction towards their own greenhouse gas reduction goals. The most important thing for me to state here is that a project must have the ability to demonstrate additionality that is going beyond the business as usual. And now, speaking about how they are traded, let's assume that a manufacturer is allotted 100 units of greenhouse gas emissions in 1 year. Under a business as usual scenario, the company could expect to emit about 120 units of greenhouse gas, though the long-term goal is that the manufacturer finds ways to produce without emission. But in order to meet its regulatory burden in the short term, the company would need to buy carbon offset to bring its emissions down to the 100 units mandate. Now, the other side, which is the supply side, is if a landowner, for instance, agrees to forgo aggressive timber harvesting, which we call deforestation, on a certain tract of land in perpetuity, it can receive an offset credit and then it can sell to that manufacturer. So the landowner can generate full cash, so to put it, and the manufacturer also can meet its regulatory mandate. Now, it's not always just as simple as that, because the landowner also has to go through some regulatory process to make that offset process happen. So most times this landowner, they need help in planning the timber conservation project so that they can be able to get at least the maximum amount of credits as much as possible. And to do this, they need a specialized help. So they then turn to a carbon advisor who has a deep experience in carbon offset regulations and markets. And just like any other commodity, the credits are traded in a market. And the market is categorized into 2. We have the compliance market, we have the voluntary market. Now, the compliance market is highly regulated by either a national, regional, or international carbon reduction regime. And that market operates under a cap and trade system, which means that you have only a certain amount of allowances. So basically, you're allowed to emit a cap of greenhouse gas. And usually the government gives different industries different caps for that kind of emission limit. So it is important to note that in this compliance market, you can't create or remove allowances, but you can trade them. So for example, if an industry has a mandated target, or better yet, if they emit less than they were allowed, they can sell the extra credit to someone. So that's how the carbon market operates. And we have the European Union ETS, we have the California market as well. Now, the voluntary carbon market, on the other hand, enables businesses, governments, non-profit organizations, individuals to offset their emissions outside of a regulatory regime. So just as the name implies, it's voluntary. There are specifically no rules here. Of course, different standards have their rules, but it's unlike the regulated market. So now, trading and demand in the voluntary market can be created only by voluntary buyers, whereas in the compliance market, demand is created by the regulatory mandate. And unlike the compliance market, the price for the voluntary market credits, they're usually lower and they're impacted by project type, the project size, the location of the project, the co-benefit, and vintage. And vintage being the year that the reduction happened.
Thank you. So, how does carbon trading impact the transition to clean energy?
Well, it has been argued and found to be true that one of the most efficient and cost-effective ways to reduce climate-altering emissions is to put a price on carbon. So you could do this either through a cap and trade program or through a carbon tax. A price on carbon means that we're actually reflecting the real cost of carbon emissions. Now, when you put a cap on absolute level of emission and reducing the cap over time, it allows the regulator to be able to control the quantity. And yeah, of course, the market has to determine the price, but the regulator has control over the quantity of emission. Now, when you go by the means of a carbon tax, here you can only control the price, but you can't control the quantity. So what happens here is that the price then determines the quantity of emissions you have. Now, this price incentive usually could be in two distinct ways. It could incentivize in different ways. First, the energy from high emitting fuels becomes more expensive and therefore it becomes less profitable for companies. So if a company is to give a clear economic incentive to cut their emission, they'll usually find the cheapest way to do it. And also in a compliance market where companies are able to trade surplus credits, they have that financial motivation to reduce their overall emissions. So we see how that works. And secondly, the price of carbon makes low emitting fuels more profitable. Now, non-emitting sources like hydro, wind, we begin to see an increased margin when a carbon price is introduced. So in terms of operation, non-emitting sources are already cheaper than fossil fuel sources because the fuel cost is usually cheaper and sometimes there's no fuel. The carbon price doesn't affect how much the existing non-emitting sources generate, but it encourages more of these generators to be built. So you see more companies tilting towards renewable energy as opposed to fossil over time. Now, companies would always look out for the least cost way to reduce their emissions. So sometimes they're even able to sell this reduction to other companies as well.
So, are there any current mechanisms for trading carbon credits in Nigeria?
Yes, but we have to go back down the lane to the early Kyoto Protocol years. The project's implementation under the Carbon Development Mechanism started as far back as 2005, and the first project in West Africa was registered in 2006. Now, the CDM activity has been largely stalled, given the outcome of COP26. So now they're limiting post-2020 credit issuance and they're now focusing on activities that are transitioned to Article 6. So as at this time, there's a lot of uncertainty as to the regards of what the future emission reduction generation potential would be. And the expectation is that future financing would flow from a share of currently registered CDM projects, and they would resurface only these activities that are authorized by host countries. That is what Article 6 is about. And at the same time, outside of the CDM activities, we've seen quite a number of projects under the voluntary carbon market, that's VCM. It's been gaining a lot of ground with the demand to meet different countries' net zero commitments and their voluntary offset commitments as well. So there's been quite a lot of offset projects that have been registered in these programs. And we have the Gold Standard International, we have Plan Vivo, we have the Verified Carbon Standard, which is operated by Vera. We also have the GCC. Now, we also have some tradable instruments, which are under the Voluntary Renewable Energy Certificates. We call it RECs. And we also have some renewable energy projects from Nigeria that are registered there. Now, I must mention here that the percentage of registered projects in all these standards combined is not even up to 5% of the global registered activities. Okay, I'll say here that it's not just Nigeria, it's like the general African situation. But the good news here is that the Nigerian government just announced that it's going to start with the ETS, that's the emission trading scheme, which carbon output will be capped across different sectors of Africa's biggest economy. So that's like a good thing for us here. Though there's not much detail at present, but the scheme looks set to have a cap and trade mechanism, which is similar to the EU ETS and the Californian compliance market.
Thank you very much. We look forward to this scheme kicking off. So, how can carbon trading help to improve the adoption of clean energy solutions in Nigeria?
Well, many off-grid energy companies are still struggling and they're trying to meet up with revenue goals, and they have to depend on grants, they have to depend on equity financing. But with carbon trading, they're able to tap into the international voluntary carbon markets. And we now have an end game for this market. We know that Nigeria has to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2060, according to the plan. This means that we have to get serious with carbon pricing. We need to have a market system that works. And honestly, a rapid energy transition will not happen without the implementation of some policy measures. So with carbon trading, what will happen is that it will begin to drive carbon finance into the country, because now we might have a lot of unused allowances. It will not give a lot of room for these credits to also be traded. And now the earnings from this trading can now be channeled towards clean energy solutions as well. So now looking at it from the angle of the compliance carbon market, it is quite complex, but it is much more valuable. And this is a good time for the launch of the ETS market implementation in Nigeria, because it would force energy intensive industries, manufacturers, power companies, transport companies, the oil and gas, the airlines to either lower their emissions or pay for each ton of CO2 that they emit. And the idea here is that there is now enough motivation for them to lower their emissions. So carbon finance through ETS, it will drive growth to offset projects, and it will enable companies to also decarbonize, which ultimately enables a net zero emission by 2060.
So, finally, how will you suggest the government improves carbon trading in Nigeria?
Yes, this is a very good one, because Nigerian contributes so little, yet climate change is hitting us very hard. And we have least restrictive or unenforced environmental regulations in Nigeria, to be honest. So it is vital for us to increase participation both in the voluntary carbon market and in the compliance market. This would allow us to continue to develop our fossil fuel reserves, and we simultaneously can channel the revenues from carbon credit sales to speed up the development of the renewable energy sector. So West African countries, looking at the statistics, we only have access to a small portion of global climate finance flows. And an analysis was done, and we see that we've only received about 4.4% of the global flows from climate finance funds since 2006, with the exemption of adaptation funds. So having carbon financing would be very effective to unlock investments in mitigation actions like clean cook stoves, safe drinking water, and increased participation will ultimately increase investment. And looking at it from what the government needs to do, the European Union developed the ETS market in 2005, and it is like the world's first major carbon market and is one of the biggest. So the government can use that as a template to step up the game. Of course, the market might have some challenges, might have some things that we shouldn't impute into our own system, but we can use that template to step up the game for the type of cap and trade system that we want. And also, what the government needs to do is to overcome capacity barriers. To be honest, there are not so many professionals in this field, so capacitation needs to be done. We need to have a lot of human capital and resources to ensure that we have an institutional coordination. Then also, back in the years and even now, the voluntary carbon market has lost some credibility. And so with the ETS, we can improve on transparency to make the market more effective. And the framework for this market should allow for growth so that we can have vibrant set of opportunities for different projects. Ensuring that projects are undertaken within the region is also very important. The kind of projects that are being done within Nigeria should also be taken into account, and the government should ensure that there are no negative impacts on the environment and the social values of the local people, because many a times these projects are done in different rural communities, and it is very important that we ensure that the projects that are being done do not have effect on their environment, and it doesn't affect their social values as well. The government can assist small communities by ensuring that they're bundled together. Instead of having different dispersed community groups, we can have these groups together so that they are able to access carbon finance, and it reduces overhead costs for small projects. And in some cases, the local government also needs to play a good role of being the developer and the facilitator. So generally, there's need for continued collaboration, support, advocacy around the development of these market-based solutions. And so the government needs to partner with private organizations, developers, different not-for-profit organizations to be able to push this energy transition.
Thank you very much, Oluwatomi. That was a really, really educating session.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for listening.